former newspaper editor, is going to join me to speak about Rudd when he was Prime Minister, how he allowed his phone call with the then President George Bush to be overheard and leak. Also, Penny Wong claims she can't answer questions about our story on why intelligence chiefs were taken off the National Security Committee of Cabinet. And new figures out today prove that Labor's promise last year to get migration under control was another broken one. But first tonight, we can reveal more footage of Kevin Rudd calling Donald Trump a political liability, saying that he's a problem for the world and must be removed as president. The freshly unearthed footage showing Rudd ridiculing Trump's intellect raised serious questions about his viability in Washington should Trump return to the White House. The footage obtained by our team at skynews.com.au today comes after Trump called Rudd nasty and said he wouldn't stay long in his posting if he remained hostile towards him. Well, Trump's remarks about Australia's politically divisive and controversial Washington ambassador have gone global, with Rudd's media and political supporters working overtime to claim he's doing a terrific job and has developed contacts on both sides of the aisle. But Rudd can't escape from his past invective, which is now coming back to bite him as Trump's path toward the White House gathers steam. Rudd had clear disdain for the then President Trump and spoke about him time and time again in a patronising way, including at this address to the Oxford Union in 2017.
Trump, at present, represents a political liability for both sides of Australian politics. So if you're going to defend the proposition of an alliance with the United States, for the future, it has to be done in terms of the alliance is intrinsically valuable, whatever the future may hold, and Trump's only around for another 3 years, maybe less, depending on the midterms.
Well, that was in October 2017. Trump was president at the time. Unwise remarks from a former Australian Prime Minister with clearly little understanding of American politics and of the immense support that Trump had amassed. But it gets worse. Rudd claimed Trump was a problem for the world.
This guy is a problem. He is an objective problem for the world, for the region, for my country. And of course, not as an American, I will not comment on the problem he represents to the United States domestically. So he's a buzzword.
And in other stunning comments, Rudd also urged the Republican Party to remove Trump.
That the Republican Party, which enabled this guy to be elected, have a deep responsibility to accept responsibility for the consequence of their actions and begin the processes for one form or another of his removal by constitutional means.
Isn't it ironic that that advice came from a man who himself was removed from office by his own colleagues? Well, Trump just yesterday said that Rudd wasn't the brightest bulb, and it turns out that Rudd had criticised the then president's own intelligence.
And Donald, as we know, is not a leading intellectual force, but Donald has, a basic sort of political instinct, and his campaign was, all you people out there from Trumpland.
Rudd was also critical of Trump's character, claiming he was unpredictable and made life difficult for his own staff.
Well, welcome to the psychic world of Donald Trump, because that's what it's like. He just changes. He turns on a dime. You don't have to be the president of China to have that experience. Try being a member of his staff. You'd have that experience every day.
I mean, that's funny because Rudd feeling sorry for Trump staff when Rudd's own political advisors in Canberra had to put up with this.
I get to the very end, yeah. Dead. Oh.
Well, HR departments weren't such a big thing back in the Kevin 07 days. Rudd also claimed that Trump was turning Americans against each other in comments at Cambridge in 2019.
Have you looked at a Trump rally and how many angry white men there are in those rallies? Look at the tax cuts. Look at the windfall that are tax cuts to the wealthiest 2% of the country. They're not debated, however, in the United States, rarely. What's debated every day is the wall in Mexico. What's debated every day in the United States is Trump railing against one group of foreigners after another.
Well, Rudd didn't discriminate with his hostile remarks towards Trump. He made them on Twitter, on the ABC, even on commercial morning television, where he claimed that Trump was running politics of division.
What we have with President Trump is for him to maximise, as it were, the politics of division through his appearance yesterday in front of the Episcopal Church there just behind the White House.
Well, far from Rudd being the preeminent, polished diplomat, Trump is actually now the second president to have been humiliated by Rudd. You may recall the diplomatic debacle that Rudd caused when he betrayed then US President George Bush by allowing venerable editor-in-chief of The Australian, Chris Mitchell, to listen to their phone call and then signed off on a leak that utterly mortified the Republican president. Mitchell had been for dinner at Kirribilli House when Rudd went into his office to take a call with Bush. Mitchell says Rudd left the door open and he was able to hear the conversation. Rudd's office then facilitated the publication by the Australian newspaper of a story about that very call a few weeks later. Journalist Matt Franklin, who later went on to work for Albanese, he wrote the story and he checked all the quotes with Rudd's office, who had a transcript of the call and signed off on them. The Australian reported that George Bush had asked, "What's the G20?" Well, the front page in The Australian caused a major scandal globally. Despite his press team signing off on the quotes, Rudd then publicly denied that Bush had said those words. But the story damaged him, the president, that is. And at the time, Bush was near the end of his presidency and Rudd had relationships with Democrats Obama and Hillary Clinton. This shows how he lacks basic diplomatic etiquette. Imagine agreeing to the leak of a confidential phone call with the president of the free world. Well, Nick Hayter, who was there that evening for dinner with Rudd and Chris Mitchell, he's going to come on my show a bit later to speak about how that night unfolded. Well, Rudd hasn't responded to Trump's comments publicly this week, but people close to him, who know how often the phones ring at the embassy, told The Australian today that moments after Trump's comments went public, Republicans were calling to offer their support. But over at the new digital media outlet, The Nightly, Christopher Dawes wrote the single best piece on what unfolded. Dawes wrote about how Rudd has been reborn in the Labor Party. He writes how Kevin Rudd's own ministerial colleagues had called him a control freak, chaotic, and a bastard who had contempt for the cabinet, the caucus, and the Australian public. And Dawes also writes how Julia Gillard once described Rudd as physically imposing, bullying, menacing, and angry. Claims, of course, that Rudd says were utterly false. Well, Christopher Dawes then writes that humiliated and eviscerated by his colleagues, Rudd rapidly won his revenge, reinstated under sufferance by Labor, and later rehabilitated as ambassador to the US by Albanese. Rudd's well-documented inglorious character flaws and professional failures were erased, with Stalin-like efficiency from Labor Party history, replaced by a universally accepted new label. He's a man of admirable diplomatic prowess. And Dawes reminds us that Rudd had his sights on an even more important role than Australia's ambassador to Washington. Rudd had been lobbying the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull to put him forward for United Nations Secretary General, the world's #1 diplomat. And Turnbull seemed to have initially been receptive to this idea, but then he changed his mind. Christopher Dawes writes that responding to a furious Rudd, Turnbull said he was not suited to the role because of your poor interpersonal and management skills. That was about as tactfully as I could put it, Turnbull's quoted as saying at the time. According to Turnbull, Rudd replied, "You little effing rat, you piece of..." You can read that word on your screen. "I'm going to get you for this." And what followed was a torrent of obscenities. Dawes recalled how Rudd even had the gall to complain to the Press Council when the Australian initially reported that he was going to be named US ambassador by Anthony Albanese. He claimed at the time it was a lie that needed to be corrected. Well, the story turned out to be true. It was obviously accurate, despite Albanese himself also describing it as nonsense at the time. Well, the rift now between the potential US president and our ambassador in Washington could have been avoided. This is Albanese's own making. Neither Rudd nor Albanese are known for their magnanimity or tolerance of political rivals who've criticised them publicly. So why would they expect Trump to be uncharacteristically forgiving towards someone who had called for his removal as president? It's unfathomable that our Prime Minister has such flawed judgment that he appointed to the crucial role of US ambassador Australia's single most divisive politician who'd been brought down during his first term in office and accused of all sorts of poor behaviour, described as a bully by his own colleagues, who had humiliated the President of the United States by allowing details of a phone call to leak, and who had already described a current American president as nuts, a traitor, and a problem for the world. That Rudd, with his temper and lack of discretion, is now managing our most important strategic relationship is simply mind-boggling. Well, to discuss this and more, let's bring in National Senator Matt Canavan and National Affairs Editor of the Australian newspaper, Joe Kelly. Welcome to you both. Matt Canavan, this has been obviously a very big story the past 2 days. The Albanese government has been trying to turn it back on the coalition. Albanese outraged that Peter Dutton would dare ask about this in question time. But this is going to be a difficult relationship, no doubt, for the Albanese government to manage should Trump return to the White House, as is predicted.
Well, look, I want all of our ambassadors to succeed on behalf of our country, and I've in fact defended Kevin Rudd over the last 24 hours, and at least in terms of the examples we've seen prior to your show. Look, yes, obviously he's made some character assessments of Donald Trump, but I think people misinterpret Donald Trump and his reaction sometimes. Some of his closest confidants right now issued scathing character assessments of him in the years past. He can actually get over things if there's a mutual interest in doing so. So I think they were things that could have been repaired from. But what you've revealed tonight is a different category at all. And I'm not sure if Kevin can continue now, let alone until the election. I mean, he called there in your editorial, the evidence you've uncovered, he called for the removal of a sitting president. I mean, it's almost like a coup. He called for a coup almost within the United States. And how can anybody that has such views be appointed as a diplomat to that nation, calling for that kind of radical change? I think he has to explain himself here, and I just don't think it's right for the country. Now, the country has to come first. It's bigger than Kevin, bigger than any individual, and clearly now he's damaged goods there while he remains as ambassador to the US for our country.
I agree. Those were extraordinary comments. He did say that he thinks Trump should be removed through constitutional means. I don't know how you remove a president through constitutional means. I don't know how that's possible. Joe Kelly, what do you think about this and how? I mean, and clearly Kevin Rudd has been doing his best to brief out in the media all the work he's been doing to try and get close to supporters of Trump. But we've now heard from Trump himself that Kevin Rudd might not last long. We also heard from Steve Bannon on my show about a month ago that they were well aware that Rudd was trying to worm his way back into Trump's inner circle, but that the president has a long memory.
Oh, hi, Sharri. Well, I think a couple of things need to happen now. The first is Rudd's on notice. Kevin has to be on his best behaviour, and Kevin will always be Kevin. So I think the temptation for him will be to keep himself under check, particularly in the lead up to the next presidential election in the US. Any further comments, undiplomatic comments, even if it's just a gossip, that circulated through the DC rumour mill, could be extremely damaging. So that's the first thing. He's on notice, needs to be on his best behaviour. But the second point is, I think, whether he's viable as a future ambassador if Trump goes on to win a second term will largely depend upon the attitude that Trump takes. So if the president decides to freeze out an ambassador, there's very little that could be done except to remove the ambassador. You would hope, however, that that will not be the case. We have had good relations with the Trump administration in the past. Joe Hockey did a very good job in that regard. Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison both, I think, did well at a difficult time in the Australia-US relationship. So you'd hope that smoothness in relationships can be maintained. But I think Kevin Rudd is on notice, Sharri.
Well, let's look at this story that actually you reported today, Joe Kelly, that it was 15 employees from UNRWA, and this is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, that took part in the terror attacks on October 7 against Israel. Joe, I'll just start with you again on this topic, seeing as you reported this, that the government, Penny Wong, was told about this one day before she moved to reinstate $6 million in funding for UNRWA.
Yeah, that's right, Sharri. I feel that the Israelis, they must think they're just yelling into the wind a bit here in Canberra. They failed to convince the government about UNRWA, but I think it's probably more a case of the government not listening. So yes, the Australian revealed this morning that one day before that extra $6 million in funding for UNRWA was unfrozen last Friday. The day before, DFAT had received a briefing, and Israeli intelligence now thinks that there are 15 employees of UNRWA who directly participated in the October 7 attack. So directly participated means transferring weapons, crossing over into Israel, participating in the kidnaps or the killings themselves. So this was an update from Israeli intelligence, but I think one of the features here is the government wanted to move very quickly. It hasn't waited until the independent report of the UN has finished or the internal investigation. And I think that there's a problem now with the evidence base for this decision to reinstate the funding, Sharri.
And, there's 15 employees there who actually took part in the terror attack, so joined in on terrorism. But that's not to mention all of the other links between UNRWA and Hamas, that there were thousands who were Hamas supporters on a WhatsApp group. Hillel Neuer, who's a regular guest on the show, uncovered that. Also, the fact that UNRWA was providing electricity for Hamas tunnel networks and infrastructure located under their headquarters. Matt, there are numerous other ways that Penny Wong could send aid to Palestinians who need it.
Well, UNRWA should be blacklisted, and this is a scandal that we haven't seen the likes of in our foreign aid diplomacy since the oil for food scandal involving Iraq and the AWB about 20 years ago. I mean, how can our taxpayer dollars be going to an organisation where there is credible evidence they were directly involved in committing terrorist acts? It is just beyond the pale. And look, my heart goes out to the heartache that we're seeing in Gaza, innocent people suffering, as they always do in a war zone. And I have no problem in seeking to find a way to try and help those innocent people. But there must be a better way than continuing to fund a now discredited organisation, UNRWA. This is a shocking decision from our own government. And I think it's only the reason they're not listening, as Joe said, they're not listening to the Israel government, they're not listening to the evidence, is because Penny Wong is only listening to her own caucus, who are desperately seeking some kind of political limb to maintain their standing within Muslim communities here in Australia.
And also the DFAT officials, I mean, we've seen some of the evidence and we've played it on this show that DFAT officials have given in Senate estimates where they just mocked the idea that there have been concerns over all these years about links to Hamas terrorism. But the reality is there are other methods to get aid. We all feel devastated for innocent families and children who are suffering. The US are using an offshore barge. Why can't Australia do the same? And why would Penny Wong not even wait for the official review by the former French government minister into the UNRWA organisation before recommitting everyone? It's hard working taxpayer dollars. It is a scandal, like you say, Matt. Let's turn to the meeting today between Paul Keating and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. In a statement after the 1 hour meeting, Paul Keating said that the Foreign Minister was very positive about putting bilateral difficulties behind us as he was encouraged by the government's efforts to restore appropriate equilibrium between our two countries. China's national broadcaster however, reported that Wang Yi appreciated Keating's long-term concern and support for the development of China-Australia relations. Joe, you know, we do live in a democracy, so nothing wrong with Paul Keating having this meeting, but do you think it was disrespectful of him towards Penny Wong, given he's publicly said that Penny Wong doesn't really conduct foreign policy? She wears a lei as she goes around the Pacific Islands. Do you think it was disrespectful that the Chinese Foreign Minister as well invited Keating to this meeting, given his high-profile criticism of our Foreign Minister?
Well, Sharri, I don't think it's just disrespectful. I think it was reckless. And I think that Paul Keating at the moment is conducting himself as if he is the de facto Foreign Minister of Australia. And the Chinese are using this to kick sand in the face of the Albanese government at a time when we are supposed to be stabilising the relationship. And I think Paul Keating's interventions generally are actually very interesting. He was much more quiet when the coalition was in power, but as soon as Labor got into government, he's had a number of contributions to make, not only about the direction of the Chinese relationship, Penny Wong herself, the AUKUS arrangements, but also on tax. A couple of weeks ago, he came out and said that the top marginal tax rate in this country should not be above 40%. So I feel he's saved up all these views until Labor's got into power and is now trying to steer things sort of from behind the throne, so to speak. And I think the Chinese are trying to manipulate and use that and effectively kick sand into the face of the Albanese government.
I mean, I don't mind hearing from Paul Keating at all. He was, in many ways an excellent former Prime Minister and Treasurer. So I don't think there's anything wrong. We do live in a democracy. We all have free speech. We don't all agree on the same ideas. Nothing wrong from hearing with him. But, the main issue is, I suppose, whether he should have accepted this meeting, given he does have a different view of the relationship with China, one, Matt, that you and I don't agree with.
Well, look, I've got a different view. I don't have a problem with Paul meeting the Chinese Foreign Minister here. I think it's very important we maintain communication links with a country as important as China. And as you say, you and I would have a very different view of China and its role in our region compared to Paul Keating. But we've got to keep talking to them, or talk to them as much as we can. I mean, they haven't picked up the phone to us in the last few years. But if the proverbial does hit the fan, we'll need to have those contacts as much as possible. And I don't have a problem with Paul maintaining those things. I think what he said after the meeting was nothing particularly wrong with it. Who cares what the Chinese media says? I mean, the bigger issue here is a substantive issue about, I think Paul is a little bit naive about what China's goals and aims. Today they flew 30 fighter planes over Taiwan airspace. They do it obviously almost every day. He just doesn't seem to, I think, get the fact that we're really close to something bad going on in our region, and we need to make sure we're prepared for that.
Exactly. And my bigger fear is that the Albanese government doesn't understand and that they've been silent on Chinese foreign interference, aggression, espionage for too long, not to mention human rights abuses. Joe Kelly, Matt Canavan, thank you both so much for joining me. Now, coming up, a senior newspaper editor will join me to talk about the night that Kevin Rudd allowed a journalist to listen in on his phone call with then President George Bush. Plus, Penny Wong faces questions over dumping the intelligence chiefs from the National Security Committee of Cabinet. That and more after the quick break. Welcome back. Well, my next guest is Menzies Research Centre Senior Fellow Nick Keating, who has first-hand experience of Kevin Rudd's diplomacy skills. Nick Keating was at the time the editor of the Weekend Australian newspaper, and he was at Kirribilli House on the night when Kevin Rudd allegedly left the door open while he was on a phone call with former US President George Bush. Nick joins me now. Nick, thank you so much for your time. So you were at Kirribilli House you were editor of the Weekend paper. Chris Mitchell was editor-in-chief of the Australian newspaper. You both went there to have dinner with the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, and this all unfolded. Tell me what happened.
Well, it's not unusual to be invited around those circumstances, and those conversations are off the record. I still think they were, they're not to be. I'm not going to go into what he actually said, but we were there, and Kevin Rudd was talking about conversations with other world leaders, some of whom he was not very complimentary about. And then he said he had the phone call coming up with George Bush. He made a lot of that. I mean, this is important to Kevin Rudd for other people to think he's important. And I had to leave late in the evening, but Chris Mitchell stayed on just as he was about to make this call. And I assumed that he'd be going into his office, closing the door, having a private conversation. But no, he left the door open. He spoke on speakerphone. The details of that subsequently came out. But here's the thing. When the information came out about that phone call with President Bush, and Matthew Franklin wrote the story for The Australian, Matthew ran those quotes past Kevin Rudd's office. He knew that story was going in the paper. He virtually approved of it. So that, to me, just goes to underline the fact that despite the fact that he began his career as a diplomat, he's the most undiplomatic Prime Minister I think we've had for a long time. He just had no concept of what normal diplomatic practice was.
So that story by Matt Franklin, who was a journalist, he was the political editor of the Australian newspaper at the time, he said that in the call, Bush asked Rudd, what's the G20? There was later debate about whether or not that had been said. Chris Mitchell was there, overheard the call, but the only complete transcript was held by Kevin Rudd's office. As you said, they signed off on the quotes. They also chose the timing of the story a few weeks after that night in question. So this was Rudd deliberately, it would seem, or this is what the allegation is, leaking a conversation that he'd had with the leader of the free world, knowing that the story was going to embarrass George Bush.
Not only that, a quote that was designed to embarrass him by claiming that he didn't know what the G20 was. And I don't believe that's true. I can't believe, I wasn't there to hear it, but I cannot believe that George Bush would not have known what the G20 was. But you've got to put this in the context of the time. George Bush was coming to the end of his presidency. Kevin Rudd was a great fan of Barack Obama. He knew Barack Obama. And so we're in a position where our Prime Minister was really barracking for the other side and was out to discredit President George Bush in that way. It's entirely inappropriate. And put it in the current context, it's even more inappropriate, I think, that you've got Kevin Rudd, who's now put his feelings on the record in no uncertain terms about the man who could very well be the next President of the United States. I don't see how he can carry on in that position he has as our chief diplomat in Washington. His position is untenable, particularly after what former President Bush said the other day.
Trump said the other day. But that's what's so bizarre, why Albanese would have made this appointment. Like, surely that humiliation of George Bush would have shown that Rudd doesn't have the diplomatic skills required to be ambassador, not to mention all of the numerous comments. We've played more on the show tonight about what he had said about Trump, even that he should be removed as president by Republicans.
Well, we'll reverse the situation. Imagine that the US ambassador to Australia had come out and said that, that Peter Dutton was unfit for office, that he was, he was an enemy of democracy. Albanese, either side.
Because Trump was the current president at the time. Rudd made a lot of these comments.
It is not his place to say it. It is the Australian people's place to make up their own mind about Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese.
Yes.
We wouldn't. That would be something which we couldn't really countenance, and I'm sure America would do the right thing and withdraw their ambassador under those circumstances. Just as I think that the best thing is for Kevin Rudd to realise what he's done and to gracefully step down.
Well, Nick, loved having you on, and I miss the days when you were weekend Australian editor. In fact, you were one of my first editors at the Sunday Telegraph more than 20 years ago when I was a teenager. So
you were one of the best reporters we ever had, Sharri.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Well, this week I revealed that our top intelligence chiefs have been dumped as permanent members of the National Security Committee of Cabinet. And today, Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson asked Foreign Minister Penny Wong about why this had happened during question time in the Senate.
Can you confirm reports that the government has removed the Directors General of ASIO and ACIS as regular attendees at the National Security Committee of Cabinet and that they are now only invited on a case-by-case basis?
We don't disclose the workings of the National Security Committee of Cabinet.
Can you confirm reports that the Secretary of the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water is now a regular attendee of the National Security Committee? Why does the government think that he has superior insights on national security to the Director-Generals of ASIO and ACIS?
We don't comment on the workings of those committees, but I would say to you I had never heard that before until you raised it.
Joining me now is the former head of the China desk at the Defence Intelligence Organisation, Paul Monk. Paul, thank you very much for your time. Look, Penny Wong couldn't find a legitimate reason to say why the boss of ASIO and ACIS, the Director Generals of ASIO and ACIS, are no longer permanent members of the National Security Committee of Cabinet. Instead, in a comment that we didn't play just there, she resorted to attacking James Paterson for even asking the question.
Yeah, and I've got to say, as a long-time analyst of national security affairs and as an old China hand, I'm deeply disturbed by this development, as with other things that have gone along with it, as you well know and as you pointed out earlier in the week. And I've got to be really, as it were, brutally frank in saying, if I was, as it were, to lead a coalition government into office tomorrow, the first order of business would be to reverse the decisions that have been made. I would sack Glenn Davis, frankly. I would give Peter Varghese his marching orders. And if any think tank has to be defunded on the basis that it's not contributing usefully to national security, it'd be AsiaLink, certainly not ASPI, which under Peter Jennings' leadership over a period of years became the only really serious think tank on national security affairs in this country.
Yep. So just to explain to everyone at home what you were just speaking about there, Glenn Davis heads the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. It's said to have been his decision to not have the Director Generals of ASIO, Mike Burgess, and ACIS, Kerry Hartland, as permanent members of the National Security Committee of Cabinet. Instead, they're invited in on a case-by-case basis. Glenn Davis is a distinguished public servant, but he does have a history of ties to China. He was on the Daniel Andrews trip to Beijing when Daniel Andrews first signed the Belt and Road Initiative with the Communist Party back in around 2014, 2015. He's been a university professor. He isn't known as a national security hawk, Paul Monk.
To say the very least. And what needs to be made clear in this context is the Albanese government came into office touting its national security bipartisan credentials as regards AUKUS, as regards the Quad. What we've seen since then is a slow sliding away from concrete commitments. And now it seems to me what we're seeing is an undermining of that strategic position. If the government was serious about those commitments, which Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese stood up for in the first day they were in office, what we'd be seeing is Glenn Davis not removing the heads of the security and secret intelligence services from the National Security Committee of Cabinet or defunding ASPI. They'd be saying we need to double down on funding ASPI precisely because it's close to the United States, it's serious in its analysis and it's critical of China. Because our problem is China. We want to manage that well, but to defund ASPI and to remove those guys, or individuals, the intelligence chiefs from the National Security Committee of Cabinet, is to say the very least sending the wrong signals to China, and it's sending alarming signals to those of us who take national security seriously.
Exactly. Well, we have those comments now where Penny Wong criticised James Paterson for even asking the question. Let's have a look.
Did the Prime Minister remove the heads of our intelligence agencies from NSC because they were telling him things he didn't want to hear? And will the Prime Minister commit to reinstating the heads of our intelligence agencies as regular attendees of NSC so they can provide the candid and considered national security advice that this government so desperately needs to hear?
He's generally one of the more sensible members of the opposition and somebody who understands the importance of working together on national security, and frankly that question is beneath him.
Well, that's not right. That question's not beneath him. That is a vitally important question. The public needs to know why Penny Wong, Anthony Albanese, Glyn Davis, this entire left-wing socialist government has removed the two most important voices on national security from the premier body that advises the government on the urgent threats to our security. I mean, it's just not good enough that there's no public explanation for this since we revealed it on Monday night's show.
I fully agree. And it seems to me that if the government is to be taken seriously by voters concerned with national security, it must account for these moves in a way that is in fact credible. And we both know that there are other issues, you've pointed them out on air, in which decisions by this government and commitments by the Foreign Minister raise serious questions about its priorities and its clarity of thought on matters of international security. So, I think there's some serious work to be done, and I think James Paterson is doing the country a great service in raising these questions. I think it's dismaying that the Foreign Minister would dismiss them so glibly.
Exactly. I should just point out to viewers, Paul Monk, that you are not a coalition figure at all.
No, I don't belong to any political party. And when described by some people as, and I quote an old friend, as an extreme right-winger, I've said, I don't know why you would categorise me that way. If I'm to be typecast ideologically at all, I would say I'm a John Stuart Mill liberal, and Mill was no one's idea of an extreme right-winger. He was a radical reformer and a very serious thinker. I'd like to think of myself that way. And you are indeed a serious thinker and a China expert. Paul Monk, thank you very much for joining me this evening. Now, still to come, the Human Rights Commission again shows its ineptitude by tasking an activist who was behind a list of Jews with the job of promoting anti-racism material. Plus, not one but 3 staff members are being investigated over Princess Kate's privacy breach. That's after this quick break. Welcome back. Well, you remember the activists who shared the personal details of more than 600 Jewish Australians online? Well, it turns out that one of the activists behind this list, her name is Elsa Chewett-Rosenberg, now has a contract with the Australian Human Rights Commission to produce anti-racism teaching resources for primary schools. That revelation in the Australian newspaper today. Joining me to discuss, Sky News host Danica DiGiorgio and commentator Jason Morrison.
Hi, Sharri.
Welcome to you both. Jason, my issue isn't with Elsa, it's with the Australian Human Rights Commission. How can you give an anti-racism contract to someone who was part of sharing a list of Jews, 1930s style, online?
Because in places like the Australian Human Rights Commission and other, government agencies that are meant to kind of have this quasi-independence thing about them, you'd be staggered at the number of people that regular Aussies would count as being extremists that are riddled within, either as contractors, board members, on advisory committees. A little off the topic, years ago I fought the New South Wales government against appointing a radical Islamist who I'd been in court with for almost a decade. It kept getting government board positions. It just blows you away. This person has fruitcake views. I
know exactly who you're speaking about. He still contacts me to this day.
He would.
We're not going to say his name online.
Because he loves being talked about. But the thing about it is, rolls from government board to government board, or if it's not that, it's kind of quasi-government boards funded by government money. Extremists are all through government agencies, and it's become a resting place for them. Aussies would be shocked at how many people that they know as activists have a resting position inside government authorities or funded by the taxpayer. Yeah. It's amazing.
It's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous to have a government organisation. The Human Rights Commission has a lot of questions to answer here because we have a situation where taxpayers' money is going towards someone who has allegedly been involved in the doxing of Jewish Australians, and we know firsthand the impact that this has had. I mean, we've got families who have had to go into hiding. You know this, Sharri. Families have gone into hiding. They're rightfully scared because their public information has been disseminated online in a public forum, and it's absolutely appalling. And I wonder whose department, government-wise, this lands under. But this certainly has to be investigated.
Or the Attorney General.
It must be the Attorney General's office.
Ironically.
The Attorney General's office.
It's not just this. I mean, Creative Australia, another government agency, has been giving funding to an artist who has shared anti-Semitic content online. I went and asked Tony Burke about it. It sits under his portfolio. Asked the agency. They're just nothing to see here, nothing to see here. They just don't care, this government, about anti-Semitism.
No, they don't. I mean, they've said in terms of doxing, they've said, oh, we're going to rush forward the legislation to make this, to ban it, to make it illegal. But they haven't done that yet.
No,
it's all talk.
And so what? The list is out there. That's the joke. But so what? You can have all the laws you want. The dirty deed is done. And the thing that, again, I find most farcical about it, they call themselves the Australian Human Rights Commission. They're into the human rights of some Australians, not all.
Yes, good point. Well, it's been 2 years since Brisbane won the rights to the 2032 Olympic Games, but it seems that they're only realising now that they're actually going to have to do a budget for these Olympics, Jason. There doesn't seem to be any plan to build the infrastructure and no proper costings.
There's few people in Australia that know one or two things about Olympic Games. I'm surprised they haven't been given the call up to just head a few hundred k's north of the border and have a conversation with the government in Queensland. The people in Sydney know how it works, and we didn't have as much time as Brisbane in Sydney has had. Warning. Brisbane got very early warning. They've blown 2 years. They could be well ahead on all of this, and they're now pretty much at what Sydney got as warning time for the Olympic Games. And Sydney pulled it off with magnificent venues, but a hell of a lot of money and a lot of public will and spirit. And the government's job up there is to maintain public will and spirit as much as it is to find it. And I reckon if you went down the street in Brisbane and asked people, do you want the Olympic Games, plenty of people would say no. That's wrong. Because it will be a tremendous thing for this city, and it will be great for the country, and it'll be fantastic for the spirit of the country. And, you know, I can't believe we're umming and ahhing about this. I really can't. Even in tough times, we'll find the money for this because it's important.
I mean, I just remember the excitement when Antonio Samaranch announced that Sydney was the winner of the Olympic Games, and, you know, everyone stayed up till 4 a.m. to watch the announcement.
You say it, I get chills thinking about it because it was an amazing moment.
We all went down to Circular Quay at 4 a.m. There was such amazing atmosphere, Danica, but in this instance, I mean, there's even talk about cancelling the games, and they're ignoring the independent review's recommendations. I mean, Queensland Premier Stephen Miles is nowhere on this.
He's been nowhere for a long time, let's be honest, Stephen Giggling Miles. But I just wonder who exactly is he getting the advice from? If he's not taking on board the independent recommendations to try and cut the costs here, who is he trying to appease? His union mates? Is that the problem here? But we saw what happened, of course, when Victoria, for example, cancelled the Commonwealth Games. And now, if Queensland was to do the same with the Olympic Games, we would look like a farce on the world stage. We would never be trusted again to be able to hold such prestigious events. We would be the laughing stock of the world if we are already not. And I do agree with you, Jason. I think you ask Queenslanders, would they want the Games? Probably not. There are a lot of disadvantages to the Games.
Do you know, that's why I reckon he's umming and ahhing about it.
Yeah.
Because he's just a jockey who looks at opinion polls. I mean, the bloke's never done a thing in his life that anyone's ever wanted.
Yeah.
So his entire thing is about re-election.
And the by-election over the weekend proved that.
He's vacillating on what the opinion polls are saying, so he thinks there could be votes in sort of suggesting maybe we walk away from it.
All right, just quickly before we get to the break, let's have a look at what's happening with the Royals. It seems that there are 3 staff members now at a London hospital under investigation for the leak of medical information relating to Princess Kate. Jason, what do you think should happen here?
Sack him. That's appalling. That is utterly appalling. I mean, frankly, the whole story is appalling. The whole coverage of this is appalling. The lady has been sick. There's a constitutional obligation for them to inform the government if there's a problem. If there was a problem, the government would know. And a photoshopped photograph that was done badly and explained. I mean, I'm sorry if people think I'm naive in thinking this, and I know it's great to think there's a big tinfoil plot going on here, but it could be just as it seems. It could be just as it seems. And I saw a comment yesterday online from the great cricketer Kevin Peterson, who knows this couple and who lives in the area of Windsor. And he says he sees them out all the time. Now, I mean, no one's paying him to say this. He's just a pobby cricketer.
You know what? We need to leave these people. I feel so sorry for Kate. Imagine having your medical records breached. That is an appalling. That is an appalling. It's disgusting. I can't even think of it. But you're right. They've gone down the tinfoil hat route. My favourite from this week was the one where they said Diana's still alive and Kate's gone to live with Diana.
Oh, jeez.
That was the best.
Apparently the Paddington thing wasn't real either with the Queen.
Apparently.
Adding to bet. Jason Morrison, Danica DeJoy, great to see you guys again. All right, after the break, we'll look at the new immigration numbers out today, and it seems Labor's Big Australia push rolls on. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, new figures out today show that immigration numbers to the year to September have soared to nearly 550,000 people, more than twice the population of Hobart here in just 1 year. Well, let's bring in macro business chief economist Leith Van Onselen. Leith, this is your biggest concern. 550,000 people. What do you think about it?
Look, Sharri, to be honest, this is the reason why Australia has a rental crisis. So Australia's population grew by 660,000 people in the year to September, and 83% of that was from net overseas migration, which went up by 550,000, as you just said. In the September quarter, we had 145,000 net overseas migrants, which was the second highest quarterly number in Australia's history. And Australia's population growth rate of 2.5% was actually the highest since 1952. So these numbers are off the charts. We've got record immigration in every single major state across Australia. And at the same time, Australia only added 156,000 homes in the year to September, which means we added one home per 4.2 residents. So this is why the vacancy rate is at a record low. It's why rents are skyrocketing. It's why Australians have been forced into homelessness or in group housing. And the blame rests squarely with the Albanese government, which has thrown open the immigration floodgates without a plan to house these people or to provide infrastructure for them. It's as simple as that.
And I mean, to think the Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neil promised to bring immigration back to more sustainable levels just in December, but then we've seen that January was a record month, 55,000 net migration. Meanwhile, the ABS today confirmed that the unemployment rate has dropped back to 3.7% from 4.1%. I mean, that is good news, though.
Yeah, it is. Look, they always say that the monthly labour force survey is a lottery, and that was certainly the case this month. This result absolutely stunned economists, I've got to be quite frank. Economists had tipped an unemployment rate of 4% and 40,000 jobs created. Instead, we got 3.7% and 116,000 jobs created. So it's a massive result. That said, I think it's actually a bit of a rogue result and number one. The reason why I say that is pretty much all the leading indicators for the labour market have been going in the opposite direction. So this includes job ads, applications per job ad, industry surveys. They're all pointing to higher unemployment. And the other important thing to notice is that hours worked across the economy has also been incredibly weak. So hours worked even with this strong result, only rose by 0.8% over the year versus population growth of 2.5%. So what I expect is that the unemployment rate is going to tick higher. We need to create 35,000 jobs per month just to keep the unemployment level. And it's going to keep rising over the year, which is going to eventually force the RBA to cut.
Yeah, and the RBA has, of course, predicted that as well. Leith Van Onselen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for your company this week. I'll see you 8 o'clock Monday. And right now, the king of television, Paul Murray.